right, let's get this party started, you know? Yeah. Whenever they're ready is when I take my cue, you know? There's no backstage here. All the prep is in your face. So, this is the 3 p.m. program, Genre and Exploding Form, presented by the Whiting Foundation. And here we have today Anthony Cody. Unfortunately, Andrea Lawlor could not make it. And we have Nana Nkweti, and the moderation will be done by Lincoln Michel.
Yes.
Duncan Club!
Hello everyone, and welcome to Genre and Exploding Form, a panel presented by the Whiting Foundation. And yes, as she said, Andrea Lawlor had to head back. They didn't want to get caught in the rain, but they send their regards and regrets. But I'm very excited to be here with Anthony Cody and Nana Nkweti, whose books are truly very boundary-breaking, surprising works that, as an author, made me feel both very jealous and inspired when I was reading them. I think that, sadly, we're not doing book sales here, but I hope that you all check out the books online, bookshop.org, your local independent bookshop. We're going to start, also thanks to the Brooklyn Book Festival, of course, and as well as everyone from the Whiting Foundation who put this panel together. We're going to start by having each of the panelists read a short excerpt of their work so you can all get a little taste. And Anthony, would you mind starting?
All right. Thank you, Lincoln. Thank you, Nana. I'm excited to be here, and I thank you all for braving the elements. It's been like 19 years since it's rained in California, where I flew in from, so it's good to see rain. So I'm going to read from my collection, and then one poem, then I'm going to transition to new work, because we want to talk about forms and expanding forms. So the first poem I'm going to read is from the book. It is titled, "An Old White Man Is Not Gil Scott-Heron Saying, Because I Always Feel Like Running, Not Away, Because There Is No Such Place, Is Not How You Pronounce Exile or Escapar. An old white man is now my father, was once his father, and one day a stranger may assume I am. Gil Scott-Heron dies on the same day astronauts aboard Endeavour walk on what is perceived the final walk in space by NASA, and was born 97 years to the day Carlos Esclava was lynched for theft in Mokelumne Hill, California, before a crowd of about 1,000. I always feel like running, not away, because there is no such place. In the night, the air is what I find in a dream. When I reach for the hand of a friend, all that remains is a round patch of scar at the end of his right arm. He does not skip a beat and places the limb in my palm, and I cradle it. He says it has been a long time since we touched. This is true. I do not pull away, want to. He laughs, pulls away, and does a handstand with his good arm, and a spider appears. Said it is a frontera window. He crawls through, stands, waves goodbye. Pronounce exile like exhale, like missile, like monkey, like key, like a door that must be opened, and while a clave exists, you cannot make it from your own mouth. Escapar is not a choice, but the shape of a hand carving itself moonlight. So I finished the book, and I was in the middle of an MFA program, and I still had to finish. So I wrote another book, which is forthcoming in this coming April. And it's kind of around climate and apocalypse. And I'm going to start with a little audio file taken from a study on climate, as well as the last time there was a rainstorm in between of the time I was writing the book. It didn't rain in California for about 8 months. I just happened to record it.
What are the valued norms and behaviors that human societies will wish to maintain or fear as they see it? Primarily, they have little time and space for reinventing holding the norms of the current society. Civilization, resilience, and to attempt it would be to assume we are in a situation of calculated attempt. What do we need to let go of? I have dubbed this with these words adaptation. And restoration asks us, What systems bring back denial to help us with the coming? Feeding a sense of tragedy. I have done inevitability, the deep adaptation agenda. I know you may have little time to joking or reinventing your system. Why?
A, will you listen to the voice sculpture, deep adaptation? B, will you listen to the voice sculpture again and write? C, will you remember the sound of the chimes? D, will you be able to write in the shape of those chimes? E, what is value? What do you value? F, what can you relinquish? Have you tested your grip strength? G, when was the last moment that something was pulled from your hands? H, in the deep adaptation, how will you tell the tangible goodbye? J, have you considered the taste of water uncontaminated? I, if you could cleanse and decontaminate one watershed, would it be the one you drink from or the one the largest population on the planet drinks from? K, in the deep adaptation to climate, I might not be theoretical, so which watershed would you choose? I think about people drinking from aquifers that are now contaminated or completely dried out. Which is worse? M, would you fight a man for the last bottle of milk for a baby? N, have you considered the ways in which your footprint, literal and figurative, can be negated? O, are you still reading? P, are you still listening? Q, have you considered how a family tree stops growing? R, how will you communicate when the cooling systems for all the internet server farms run out of water? S, what is post-internet? T, who is in control? You. Are you here? Thank you.
And Nana?
Thank you so much. Let me know if you can hear me. I tend to stand when I do these things because I like to be really emotive and let my body move. And sometimes I get possessed. I've sometimes done like an Egyptian mummy walk across the stage just because. I'm going to be reading from The Living Infinite, which is in my short story collection, Walking on Cowrie Shells. And in it, I have a number of stories which dabble in different genres. I write in different languages. I write from YA to sci-fi to magical realism. And all those different types of genres and modalities allow me to kind of explore and come at stories slant. At the end, when we're talking about exploding forms, I have a QR code that you can scan, and actually it takes you to additional material. And on my website, there's an immersive experience where you get to be in, to read a faux blog that is written in the voice of internet speak, and it's referenced in the final story. It also has music and songs that were inspired or included or referenced in the stories, and a glossary of Pidgin English terms. So as much as I can, I try to take things from the page and into the world and have an immersive experience as much as I can. One day, hopefully the sci-fi stuff will happen and it'll pop right out of the book and it'll be like speaking to you. But for now, QR codes is where it's at. Since the death of her husband, Nala has felt at sea, utterly adrift. Memories are rare pearls sifted from the silt of her grief. She remembers years as a youngling, raised on the shores of an African land. Portuguese explorer Fernando Po had named it for the spectral crustaceans flitting forth from sandy burrows, mating in opal lagoons for days on end. In the sun-dappled throes of their ecstasy, they made easy and quite tasty prey. Secreted away in the shade of mangroves, Nala would cleave open their porcelain shells, reveling in the burst of salt and zesty taste of life on her tongue as she dove into the sweetly tender morsels of flesh within. Her most recent memories flow from the bayous and wetlands of Louisiana, home to her late husband of 45 years, Byron. The night she met him was a watershed moment, of which, if one embraces life in all its complexities, there are sure to be many, especially for one such as she, who had lived to the ripe young age of 202. Across a humid bar in a beachside gazebo Set so close to the shore that the pounding of the sukus beat nearly rivaled the din of the crushing surf, Byron laid eyes on her. He was all fire burn and swagger, ordering a grasshopper for the lady in the coral dress without so much as a bonsoir, chérie. And though she was a whiskey-neat woman, Nala wasn't one to turn down a complimentary cocktail or the good-looking man bold enough to buy it. Full of big dreams and sweeping plans, this Akata was nothing like the tontons of her sleepy waterfront town, or even the big shots she bedded in the bustling port town of Douala. The hunt grew new to her, a mamiwata, a seasoned seducer of thousands of men, now made eager and shy and trembling as he took her hand. She thrilled to it. As they danced hip to hip, she inhaled an intoxicating mixture of clean mint, briny sweat, and something unknowable that reminded her of whale song and undertows and dark ocean depths where there be monsters. As Byron walked her home later that evening, she noted that he'd grown solemn, perhaps wondering where his night would end, by her doorstep or her bedside. She was wondering herself. She would fuck him silly, of course, but the rest, the strange need to hear him talk, to smell the creme de menthe on the tip of his tongue, what was that? She was damned if she knew. Seeking answers, she began the first of that night's several tests, ordering him the tasty fried grasshopper she loved to munch on after an evening out on the town. Taste this, Nala demanded, pressing a small brown packet from a street vendor into Byron's waiting palm, even as she pressed the first mystery bite to his lips. She watched him take a tentative nibble, chew in contemplation, taking his sweet, 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 sweet time. Well, say something. Do you like it? It's pretty good. Très bon. What is it? A local delicacy, she demurred. Fried grasshopper. And she waited for the spit take, for the frown. Well, damn, he said, smiling. You're already halfway to being a bayou girl. When you come visit me, I'll cook you up some gators and frog legs. Ha! She laughed and whirled around in a little jig. She went keeling into him, dizzy, like she swum up to the surface too fast. Her soul effervesced. Was this happy? All right, find it.
Thank you both. All right, so this panel is called Genre and Exploding Form. It seems appropriate to start with a question about genre. You know, I think genre is interesting because it's this kind of important thing that, you know, in terms of how books are sold and how people debate books, but at the same time, it's kind of nebulous and it can mean a lot of different things, whether it's poetry versus journalism versus fiction, or age categories like YA versus adult, or science fiction, you know, detective fiction, and so on. So both of your books blur genre boundaries, thus this panel. But I wanted to start by asking you how you approach the question of genre. Do you think about genres as different traditions you're working in and subverting, or is genre something you don't put in your mind when you're writing, and that's like, you know, for the marketing people later? And Nana, maybe I'll ask you to start.
I think for me, like, I've had to kind of unlearn these labels. I come from a hyphenated American background. My parents from Cameroon, West Africa, and that kind of magical realism and that kind of understanding that there's a kind of another world beyond the veil is very part and parcel of that African upbringing. So when people call things mystical or supernatural, I'm just like, isn't that just life? You know, isn't that just every day? So when you come from those backgrounds, you're like, you know, you can hear your mama saying, don't go to that house because she's got witch. And, you know, I'm not going to be saying, my American brain is like, come on, I don't believe in witch, but am I going to go to that house? No. I'm not trying it. So this is a kind of blurring of lines that is, you know, integral to who I am as a person and how I've grown up. It's only when you start now trying to write in these different types of forms and people tell you, no, don't write that because that's this, you know, and I come from that background. I was also very much a blurry young girl, black nerd for you guys in the know. And I was reading sci-fi and, like, you know, and space odysseys and space operas from a very young age. At the same time, I was reading, Pride and Prejudice and Thomas Hardy. All these things were happening to me at the same time. So they all in my head, had that capital L literature in it. It's only when you get, you grow older that people start to kind of make, oh, that's just not literature, poo-poo, ha-ha. And I think that, sometimes writing can be all the poorer for it, because if people tell you what literature is and they tell you can only write in a certain modality, you don't interrogate, you don't push, you're not pushing boundaries, you don't allow yourself to dabble into graphic novels and read them as voraciously as I do. You don't allow yourself to read sci-fi, you don't allow yourself to read romance novels and take that erotic scene and finally write a good literary sex scene. And I think those are all things that I allow to enrich whatever work I'm writing. And as I mentioned with this book, like sometimes I try to do things like the traditional way, and I ended up coming at a story slant. I have a zombie apocalypse story set in Africa. Initially, when I was writing it, I was trying to write some great kind of Autumn of the Patriarch, looking at like all these kleptocratic, African dictators, and it's supposed to be a very serious tome. I was reading all these books from these serious authors, and I found myself stuck. And it wasn't until I was trying to write a fun, like relax yourself zombie romp that it allowed me to kind of come now and interrogate and speak on all the things I had wanted to discuss about the denigration of Africa, the poverty, and think about the IMF and unjust, lending practices. All those things ended up being on my quote unquote light zombie romp. And sometimes that's what, you have to kind of allow yourself that chance to play, and genre allows you to play in that way. If you don't let yourself be labeled, if you don't let yourself be reduced, it kind of expands and explodes the world. So.
Same question.
Yeah, I think that's a great, having to unlearn genre, I think is critical in so much of the work we do as world builders, be it in a novel, in a short story, or in a poem. And I really, for me, I've found myself not thinking about the capitalism and publishing behind it. I remember when I finished my book, what would be my book, it was like draft 1, and I texted a friend and I said, well, I made something that no one's ever going to be able to publish without going bankrupt. And I remember I never had thought about that until that very last moment where I thought something was complete. But I found that liberating because I could make the poems and sort of the docu-poetic element to it without the restriction that I normally would have given myself prior to all the other attempts I'd made at writing books leading up to that point, because I found it like a large dam, truly, that I built, that I accepted, I let it built everything up, and I couldn't get through it. And so in doing that, kind of opening it up and not thinking about sort of the product and just going through it and building was really liberating for me.
Well, so genres are one kind of border, but obviously not the only ones. And I think another kind of commonality between your two books is that they interrogate and cross over other borders, whether geographic, cultural, other kind of human constructed borders. And I know, Anthony, that for you, this is a major artistic and kind of political concern, and I imagine also for Nana as well. So could you speak to how you see your work interrogating borders other than genre? And maybe Anthony, I'll ask you.
This was definitely, for me, I'm from Fresno. Fresno is like the home of like the narrative poet, given birth to a whole school from Phil Levine. And so I'm supposed to write narrative poems. I'm supposed to keep it to the left margin. I'm supposed to be very restricted. And I would write those poems. And in the same way I was thinking in genre, I was feeling that way about the poem. And it wasn't until I started like thinking about it and walking around like a madman being like, the 8.5, 11 page is a lie, man. Don't pay attention to it. Let it, and I started like interrogating myself of why I'm feeling that way. And I started thinking about my own identity as an Irish Mexican and trying to understand border crossing and the people who came here on my maternal side versus my paternal side, who came from Ireland and then Oklahoma, and thinking through, if I went back to 1848, am I, the victim or the oppressor? And so I started looking at that field of the page and just pushing it as just another border, and how far can it go? How far can I push it? And you can kind of see where I'm looking at the page now, between those two poems I read, right? Where I'm taking just not only from the page across the spread of the spine of the book, now trying to think about how far can I push a page, and also thinking about multidiscipline, trying to see how far I can take the page into, say, an art gallery, to try to create a new way of engagement, because ultimately I'm also thinking about crossing the borders between like literary and communal spaces, because before I can even think I write for myself, I want to like have a literary history that I can share with my own family and the people that come after me in my own family and my community.
Yeah, it's so interesting. You know, you and I share some commonalities in terms of that hybrid identity, and I'm very much cognizant of the fact that, like, you know, the identity part of me that is marginalized, that Africanness is the you know, this one that gets stories that are told about that culture and are told about the people, and they're essentially very essentialist and reductive. And so I find myself, one of my missions in my writing is to subvert people's expectations, to complicate the narrative. So I'll, you know, and that happens within the subject matter of the story, within the characterizations, but also happens with the forms. So even with the first story in my collection, it's a story that's told in 2 volumes. The first half is told from the perspective of like an adoptive couple, like, you know, the man is African, the woman is American, and they are adopting a poor African child, so they think, and that child tells her story in the second half of the second volume. I'm playing with form because their story is kind of told in a kind of Greek chorus, first person plural. It's written in the form of an apologia, where they're trying to do direct address, and it's like, don't believe everything you hear about us. We're not those slick slickies, you know, who pimped out our daughter. So they're telling you, and they're trying to kind of, you know, implore you to understand where they're coming from. So they are unreliable narrators. And then you get the African daughter who comes there, and she's like, okay, you think you plucked me out of obscurity? I'm gonna take you for all you're worth and get my idea of the American dream. And she's also an unreliable narrator because she tells all types of lies to get what she wants. So I'm always playing with that, and even within her speech, she's jumping between Pidgin English and French and English, and it allows me to show the nuance and the diversity of those cultural experiences that, you know, maybe typically in any other story or by any other writer, she might be flattened. She would be flattened, the parents would be flattened, and that complicated transnational adoption and migration story will become like this one type of, you know, Western savior now takes poor African child from the village, and the end. And I'm like, bunk that. I'm gonna break that up and explode that and have it like fall into pieces all around you in tattered confetti, and you're gonna be confused and you're gonna know who to root for. And that's happening at the, you know, at the very line and sentence level. It's happening at the level of subject matter, and it's just happening in a way that I create and center the narratives. So that's how I kind of just see my mission is just to kind of add those layers of complexity and subvert everything you thought you were going to see when you came into that story.
Yeah, that what you were just bringing up, it strikes me as another kind of commonality between your work is a real mixing of different types of language. I mean, literal different languages, English and Spanish, English and French and other languages, but also mixing language from other sources. There's a lot of kind of nonfiction documents and Borderland Apocrypha, and there's kind of the lingo of geekdom and other things in your stories. And yeah, I don't know, I guess this is an extremely broad question, but how do you think about mixing all those different languages in your work? And maybe
Yeah, I think that's a great point. For me, I know when I was beginning my journey as a writer, I would always think about the sort of code switching that was happening in books. And then I would always, you know, there's always that glossary. This is how you know these words. And like over time it upset me in a way that I was like, we have Google. I mean, we have smartphones. You can even live translate a book now. So that was kind of an intentional effort, because I also thought about, like, what if my grandfather, if he were alive, would he want to read this book? There's parts that he could read. Maybe there's parts that are only for him. But also, when I start exploding the form and I start looking at, like, the visual poem or, like, the visual of a page, I'm also thinking through sort of, I think about it like using these source documents, almost like I guess, maybe like a DJ sampling things, right? Like, I have these different tools in my bag that I need for this story, and I want to make sure that is elevated to the point that needs to be. I'm not centering myself, so I want those forward. So I'm like sampling these things, trying to lay out a certain truth about these histories I'm writing about. So I guess every poet wants to be like a rock star or like a DJ, and that's how I do it.
I mean, for me, yeah, I'm absolutely sampling as well. And I think that that sampling comes very, once again, just as intrinsic to who I am, being this kind of like cultural mutt, and just frankly, like the English language is, especially American English, is just full of calques and loan words, and it's just like a wonderful kind of like, mishmash of all this different influences, and I love it for that. And I feel like it's incredibly capacious, and I feel like, I'm just adding to that kind of conversation. So when I'm writing and my characters are speaking in Arabic, and they're speaking in French, and they're speaking in Pidgin English, and they're speaking in African American vernacular English, and I'm just like, I'm elevating all those things, and even the slangs, to the level that they occupy in my mind. They're just part and parcel of everyday speech, and shouldn't be, ghettoized and placed to the side as anything but something that's interesting and adds musicality and lyricism to like a sentence. Like here's a sentence from Night Becomes Us. In alleys, on corners, users parlay with pushers, John's politic with pimps. And like, I was like, of course I'm gonna say they're politicking with pimps, because they, it's like, I could have said they converse, I mean, there's something to be said for the language, like, of like, no make me no mine, and, like, that I grew up with. And there's something to be said for like the Englishes and the Creoles that I grew up with, which are just gorgeous and beautiful and have a kind of rhythm, and that just enriches whatever text they reside in. So it just makes sense to me. Like, I never thought, okay, this is high, that kind of high, low, oh, this is slang or this is geek slang. It never occurred to me to kind of not privilege that language, because it's communication, it's gorgeous, and it's just part and parcel of how you express yourself in the world.
All right, so yet another commonality between your two books, but one that I do find really interesting, and I think the audience will as well, is how you both incorporate like, visual art into the work, and like how it looks on the page. And you both kind of brought this up already a bit. Did you show the audience the scroll that you were reading from? Or would you mind doing that? And yeah, so.
Right? Isn't this amazing? This is ridiculously amazing. I love it.
So I'm going to ask the same question to both of you, but maybe I'll just start with.
Oh, would I copy?
Yeah, and I mean, so many of the poems in the book play around. I mean, lots of poets play around with white space, but you play around with a lot of other diagrams and historical images and erasures of text and a lot of things like that. To the point that, I mean, I think I had written down something here about how the poems often felt like art gallery pieces, but you brought that up yourself. But Anthony, could you talk about, I guess, how other art forms inform your thinking about your own work, and then how you integrate them into your poems?
I lived in New York for about 3 years while my partner was getting her MFA, and I ran an art space on the Upper West Side of Latin American and Latinx American artists. And it was it was the classic, I worked 140 hours a week kind of thing. I loved the work. I never made poems, but it was like a listening phase for me. But I remember one of the last moments that I was living in the city, I went down to a gallery and I actually took in the work of Jean-Michel Basquiat. And I sat in front of one of his final pieces I didn't know at the time, which is called Writing with Death. And I literally just started sobbing. I'd never had a visceral sort of reaction to any art before that moment. And I went home and I wrote a poem. And I believe it did something that my poems had not yet done. And maybe like the nascent I didn't even know what that was. But it was essentially the kernel for what would become the book. And in that way, thinking through spatially, thinking through seeing his work, but then also seeing how I started straying from the margin and how I think very visually and spatially on the page, and how that was its own liberation, and thinking about not the page but the canvas of the poem, and being able not to be restricted by, the classic Western idea of top left, everything starts, thinking about the histories of like the glyph, the codices of like the Americas, and having that larger conversation of how can I like disentangle and decolonize our I on the page. And so that was something definitely very intentional of trying to incorporate these moments, but also trying to like help us unlearn some things of how we engage with a book and a text.
Yeah, and similar question for you, Nana, and we both marked the same page. So if you want to describe that page again, but your book has several of the stories include graphic images, and you mentioned the QR code and the end of the last story. And I also know you're a huge graphic novel fan. So yeah, how do you think about other art forms and both, how they inform your practice and you put them literally in the text?
I mean, New York is just the city for that, right? There's so many different, there's so much different forms of art that kind of inform my writing and just really give me a thrill. This Friday, I went to go see August Wilson's The Piano Lesson and came out of there feeling all the feels. And that's how I love this city, for the kind of expansion of the horizons that it allows, whether it be me going to see a play or going to an art gallery or going to the Afro-Punk Festival, as I did just recently. That's part of and parcel of my own practice as an artist, to kind of like replenish that well with all these different types of artistic forms, and they do find bearing in my work, especially in this book where I am like using graphic, I have a story that's set at Comic-Con, and these young blurs, these young African like wannabe graphic novelists and wannabe artists are, I knew that I was going to have an ekphrastic moment where I was going to have the images kind of like to kind of bust open the text and have them be in conversation with the words on the page, and I ended up doing this piece where it's an illustration of this very kind of Walter Mitty-esque type of like daydream that this young girl is having, where she finally gets to be the vanquisher and confront the bully who has made her feel small because of all her artistic, what her friends think are pretensions, but are very much part and parcel of who she sees herself. So this story is like this Künstlerroman, which is like for her, it's like this story of this young coming of age, portrait of the young artist. And I knew that I would have to have a graphic novel element in there, because why not, So I just went on freelancer.com and hired somebody. There you go. And Schoolyard Cannibal, which is dealing unfortunately, with the very real kind of like denigration and negative imaging that I grew up with and continue somewhat, but has more counter programming today, where you often see like, cartoon imagery of like, African savages, and, they'd be tuber-lipped. I call them, here it is, right, the young girl, she's seeing herself in a cartoon, and she's drinking in definitions as she sits transfixed on a grainy carpet, chin on the kickstand of her knuckles. In Looney Tunes, she is Jungle Bunny, drum-bottomed, tuber-lipped. She coons for that rascally rabbit, savage beneath ivory smiles. So I knew I was going to put that image in there, so that the impact of that image and what that image that young mind is encountering would be also present to the reader. And so in Schoolyard Cannibal, because it has so much to do with the images and the programming and how the depiction of an entire continent in this very reductive manner, I include some of those images that were encountered and some other images of uplift and that, were kind of like in opposition to that very reductive and essentialist type of war-torn, famine-stricken, heart of darkness imaging that, you sometimes still see and I grew up with here in the United States. So I just knew that, sometimes you have to kind of, there's nothing but to put that picture there. So it won't be like oh, you imagine it. You imagine it was much worse than it was. No, here it is, right here in black and white, in full, you can see. And you can see what that might do to a person encountering that. So that was just very part and parcel of the process for me that I had to put those images because they were so, important to that narrative.
And have you worked on graphic novels? Are you writing one?
I am. Yeah, I'm a big, like I said, I'm a big blurred. I'm very nerdy. I teach graphic novels, and it's one of these things that I've been like slowly outlining and thinking about what I'd like to kind of like say. Right now, I'm doing another multimedia. I'm working on a hip hop sci-fi novella, and it has I'm working with a composer, and there's actually a YouTube video of us where I'm like the librettist and doing voice performance and kind of like a last poet type of. I'm not a poet, but I do a little something. So I'm doing a reading in that kind of voice, and they're playing. There's this gentleman playing a cyborg clarinet, and it's doing all this kind of interesting intergalactic kind of musical scoring underneath my voice. So right now, that is my current multimodal project, but the graphic novel is in the pipeline. So.
And this is maybe more of a tangential connection, but Anthony, I read somewhere that you started writing poems, or there was a period where you wrote poems on comic strip paper.
Actually, that's 100% true. I was working on the opening sequence of poems after I was trying to get a passport at a Duane Reade Walgreens in California, and a old white dude was literally like, "Where are you trying to run to?" And this was just around the 2016 election time. And I was struggling with this form for a while. And I went to the art supply store, and sure enough, me and a friend, we were like, let's just get some other paper, not thinking through anything. And I literally picked up I think it's like 5x17 case and paper comic strip that you can write your funnies on. So like if you were to open my book, and this is essentially 6x18. I wrote it on a 5x17, so it's basically the same format. So it helped expand things, and I decided to write a really long literal title, and then I had to decide what I had to do with that space, and so that kind of helped cement where the start of the book was going to be.
Nana, to bring it back to the kind of initial question about genre, you're a writer who moves between both the quote-unquote literary world and the science fiction and fantasy world and graphic novels that we talked about. And you've been to both Clarion West as well as the Iowa's Writers' Workshop. And as someone who also kind of moves between the sci-fi fantasy and literary world, we can talk about how the border between those is kind of false, which it very much is, but at the same time there's some like realities of the marketplace that really separate them. Between the literary magazines are different, the presses are often different. So I'm curious how you navigate those two worlds, and also, did you get pushback with walking on Cowrie Shells about having this mix of zombie apocalypse stories alongside realist stories, or was that not an issue?
How do I navigate? Very carefully. I was very intentional about some of the choices I made so that I would be allowed to kind of dip and dabble and straddle these different worlds. Even the choice of my press and choosing to go with Grey Wolf because I knew they would allow me for experimentation and wouldn't circumscribe me and make me small. And I think that I'm at my best when I'm swinging for the fences and allowing myself to kind of play. And if you're thinking with that, eye towards marketing, as Anthony was talking about, if you're thinking about, where will my book sit in the bookstore? Will I be under this? I mean, back in the day, they used to have like, like even I was worried about that. Like, and it's a very real consideration. Like, will they put me under, African literature interests? Would I only be like, in that one space and nowhere else within the bookstore? And these are things that you have to navigate. Even as a woman, I was thinking about like, oh, I better not put like too many curlicues in here, like, but italicized writing, or like, even like they tend to kind of do this reductive type of illustration of African books where there'll be like either an elephant or a red sunset or a baobab tree or something. I kid you not. You could just look it up. It's right there. So these are all these things I'm thinking of, like when I'm trying to figure out how will I navigate, in the world when I'm already trying to do all these things in a woman's body, as an African woman, and then I want to have the nerve to try to move amongst genres too. Am I crazy? No. So it was very interesting, going. Fortunately for me, I went to Iowa and this bastion of literary culture at the time when a lot of these types of false kind of I guess divisions are falling down. Karen Russell came to and ended up being my thesis advisor and a great mentor and friend to this day, and she does that kind of work. And Kevin Brockmeyer also doing that type of work. So, and at that time, like my classmates were Carmen Maria Machado, who encouraged me to go to Clarion West. So I'm in that kind of conversation as part of this wave of people who are saying that these false divisions that people have, erected so that they can sit on, on a mountaintop on high and say, and be these cultural arbiters and be gatekeepers, they're all BS. So I was fortunate that there was already my impulses, and that I also made sure that I gravitated and spoke and was in community with people who fan the flames of that type of renegade line-stepping behavior. Otherwise, I could have, if I had done the opposite and just hung out with people who were so, they decided what was literature, then I would have been lost. So, it's a tricky balance because people still hold, they still want to hold on to those strictures. But right now, you see, Colson Whitehead and Ta-Nehisi Coates and all, even Beloved, Toni Morrison, that was a ghost story, So there's, it's in those cultures, it's in those spaces, it's already happened. So people have to give up the ghost and forget that, forget that genre, genre and L literature with a capital L, that they know what that is, It's not for anyone to say. Yeah.
It does feel like it's changed dramatically in the last decade or so. For those of you younger in the audience, the idea of Carmen Maria Machado being a National Book Award finalist with that kind of story collection, or Station 11 being a National Book Award finalist, wasn't the case 20 years ago. But yeah, they're kind of falling down. Can I ask, you maybe already kind of said this, but would you have any advice to anyone in the audience who is an aspiring writer who wants to navigate both of those, the speculative world and the quote-unquote literary world?
I mean, I think you're in a better space, like I was saying, in terms of the timeline, and people are much more, we're increasingly hashtag as a society and a culture. Before you had to be one thing, but I get now to be, hashtag blurred, hashtag African, hashtag, writer, hashtag, professor. So that you're allowed to kind of, to inhabit many more spaces, and people kind of, I think our culture recognizes that, and is trying to be much more inclusive of all those different types of opportunities. So, and that is now also reflected in the literary world. I would say of course there are people you have to be mindful, if you're trying to get into, just be mindful and intentional who you align yourself with, who you're in community with, because there are people who, they have a vested interest in just, in holding up something as this is what this looks like, and if you don't do this, then you're not allowed to come in. And they do that because it makes them feel special, and they get to say, oh, this is what, my literature looks like, and this is what you get, this is what will get you the National Book Award, and this is what will get you a Whiting. But I'm sitting here on a Whiting panel with zombie apocalypse in here. So, so I think that, good writing will out, no matter what genre you're dabbling in, or I think that good writing, good storytelling, things that are done with soul and with intention will always, win the day.
Yeah, And Anthony, can I ask a similar question? Do you have any advice to aspiring writers out here who want to break out of the...
It's funny because in the time since I won the Whiting, I'm now a publisher as well of a small press. So I think about the gates that the gatekeepers thought they had. Those hinges are broken, and I feel like there's a tremendous opportunity out there for us to make the books that we could most wildly imagine now more than ever before. Because for myself, I'm just a Latinx kid from Southeast Fresno on the poor side of town making wild stuff, and I never, if I had listened to any of my professors, I would not be where I am right now. And I knew I had to create the community I needed at each of the stages I needed in my life, and I keep those people close to this day. I mean, they're still my first readers. I send them something, am I lost in my own sauce? Is this right? What do you think? And they tell me unabashedly, yes or no. Shut up, Anthony. Start again. And that helps. And in that same way now as a publisher, that's the same thing I'm looking for. The books that are not in that same restraint that the old guard wanted to maintain.
Great. Well, I have some more questions, but we have about 10 minutes left, and I figured probably people in the audience would have some questions too. So is there anyone in the audience who wants to ask a question for either of our panelists? Yeah.
I think your guys' like visual media, I thought was really interesting. But reading, like people narrowly off of their own sort of experience. Do you find that kind of constraining? Reading from a scroll like that versus us hearing your reading, it's a very different experience. Do you find that liberating or?
I think there's a certain liberation that is happening because that's one of the things that I wanted to sort of recreate in the book, in both this one and the next one, of how we have to, it's a tangible object that you have to navigate and kind of sit with and slow down, and it's sort of definitely like a child of the internet age, but also very much because it is a tangible thing that you have to navigate, very analog in a way. And that's something that I want to sort of see how it kind of breaks down. Because ultimately, yes, there's going to be a different result, right? What you hear, how I read it, the speed at which I'm modulating my reading versus how you're going to take it in is going to be different. But I think that's the beauty of it. You're going to take in the work how you need to take in the work.
And any thoughts on that?
On
On the
spoken-
difference between, how it looks on the page and how you listen to it.
It's interesting because I'm a very voice-driven writer, so my mind is always singing the words out, if you read people often comment that my writing is very lyrical and there's a lot of musicality to the phrases because that's how my mind is already thinking and working in that kind of is already finding the rhythm, and I find that instinctively I can write a sentence and I'll be like, I think I need one more beat to land on for this to kind of feel punctuated, not just on the page to see it, but in the rhythm of the sentence and the cadence of the sentences. And I find when I do readings that stands me in good stead because I already know how is it going to sound and how will it feel and where will I pause, and I hope that one of the reasons why I included a glossary, I was trying to work with a producer to actually do little sentences of people speaking the words in so that you can actually have a kind of auditory or kind of immersive auditory experience as well. But I'm working with a composer, so I can now actually do that, some of that kind of work, because I want the music on the page to also ring out in person or into your ear as well. So.
Great. All right, other questions? Yeah.
As a publisher, are you trying to change the shape of books that you publish, or are you trying to publish scrolls? How is that going?
I don't want to scare my managing editor or my co-publisher, but yes, definitely. I think, and this is kind of before leading up to being here, of thinking and hearing Nana talk about the idea of, what does the book look like? And why does it look the way it looks? and what in the next 50 years, how that's going to change. When we can get, something literally like, Princess Leia can pop out of a book now, right? So it's exciting to me and trying to see and push those bounds. And actually, that's something we are exploring right now. For me personally, I can say that, yes.
I would just say, like, my ebook was hilarious because I was saying, oh, can I have the music here? Can I have a music file that, plays that? And they were like, no, it'll take them 10 years to download this ebook if you want to put in all this other ephemera that you want to put in here. I wanted to have images that moved. Anyway, it is what it is. Streams, one of these days, the technology will catch up.
And there was a question.
This is a question for you, Lincoln, actually, mostly just as someone who's always calling attention to things like the craft of writing, the market of writing, like as a job, as a profession, and also that you have a great novel and a great newsletter.
Oh, thank you.
Ooh.
I'm not a plant. Just more on that, I'm so curious, like, you always seem to bring together writers who think about this, who call attention to the meta of everything. Like, what has been on your mind, what you think's on overlooked? Like, you hear a lot of these readers who come asking these questions about writing and all that. Like, what do you think you often miss out on just being the writer, getting the darn thing done, making money, like this?
Well, those are a lot of good questions. I think to like jump off of what was just said, I think we are in an exciting time where there's a lot more possibilities for different things that can be done. I'm not a publisher and haven't, other than edited a couple books, haven't been a publisher. But I do feel like there's a lot more things that could be done with immersive experiences, with kind of different shapes of books, with supplemental ebooks that like add on to the main narrative. It feels like the possibilities are getting bigger and bigger, and I do think it's a really exciting time to be writing, to be publishing. The money's not as good as maybe I've heard it used to be, but otherwise, pretty exciting. What about, do either of you have anything you would really like to see in the literary world?
One of the things I think, as publishers in the larger sense, I think there's still work to be done in how we elevate and promote LGBTQ by POC voices. I think we're definitely made a headway in the LGBTQ area, but less so in that diversity of the communities in which are being represented. So that's something that I've definitely been mindful of and thinking through.
Maybe the community's marketed too.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, I'm focused on accessibility of my work, not just here in the United States, but also on the continent. So that's a lot of my work is that I'm doing with, non-profit literary organizations in Cameroon. It's just to make sure that this book doesn't exist in like a Western context, and that it also finds its way to people who I'm talking about and their children, their grandchildren, and people who are related to them and that look like them. And I think that is, doing that, making that infrastructure. And don't get me wrong, I want to be reductive. Like the continent is brimming with literary journals, and there's so much, a number of festivals. But I'm talking about Cameroon in particular, and some of the things I would like to see, and that I'm in the process of working to kind of foster, like bookmobiles that go to villages and what have you. That's what I'm excited about, and that I hope to kind of use my own little platform to kind of foster and to elevate. So.
Great. I think we might have time for one more question, if anyone in the audience has one. Is there in the back? Yeah. So I think the question was, Nana, do you see your work as radical? How would you respond to the question about whether your work is radical?
By whose definition, though? I think that, once again, I say a lot of this work comes from a very authentic place, and it's who I am, and I think it's just some people, people often say the personal is political, so the way I navigate in the world and the way I show up is very much the way I want my characters to show up, I want my book to show up in the world, and feel that it deserves to be in all the places and all the spaces and tell the stories that it needs to tell. And I think that, if that's radical, I think we're all becoming much more radical because we're all living much more authentic lives, and we don't have to feel the need to put on a facade. So, hell yeah, radical.
I think that that is a great point to end on. Maybe I could ask you both quickly if you have, what you're working on next, or if there's anything you want to plug or shout out.
Well, I'm working on the hip-hop sci-fi novella, and yeah, so I'm working with the composer. We're trying to go to a residency and just dig deeper into that work, because I'm, like, we're talking about multimodal. I want there to be, like, music videos and hip-hop and all kinds of stuff. So if I can think of it and do it, and I find a publisher who does not think I'm too gonzo, it's going to happen.
Great.
I'm finishing up my next book that's coming out in April,
Whoop, whoop.
and
We're getting a poem drop Tuesday.
there's a poem a day drop on Tuesday from the Academy. So if you all want to see a cover, a pre-order, and the poem from inside, it's there. It'll be there hitting emails or on their site. And then also I'm actually loosely collaborating with a visual artist who actually did the cover for my first book. We've done several things together over the years. We worked on a community mural. I just finished up a little mini residency with him in San Francisco, and I might be working on a graphic novel too. But that's very early. And Josue, if you have any ears here, I'm sorry.
All right. Well, thank all of you for coming out in this rainy day. And once again, Andrea Lawlor sends their regrets for not being able to make it. Please check out all three of those books. Paul Takes the Form of Mortal Girl, Walking on Cowrie Shells, and Borderland Apocrypha. And I believe that they're not selling books right now, but I imagine both of our panelists would be happy to sign books if anyone in the audience has a copy. And otherwise, what's up? What's up next in this room?
I will tell you when I
Okay. All right. Okay.